The page lifecycle of Phoenix LiveView is something I see beginners struggle with more than anything else. It is conceptually simple, but there's a lot of little things to understand about it. Once you fully understand it, it is easy to work with, but because it's so different from anything else out there, it can be tricky. How about we create a new Phoenix project as an example? I'm going to come to a new directory here, and I'm going to run mix Phoenix new. It may take a little while to complete. When you create a new project, it's going to tell you to cd into that directory, run mixecto create, and then start the server. But before we do that, we're going to run 2 generators so that we have some live views to look at. We're going to run mix Phoenix Gen live, and we're going to create a links live view. Imagine we're creating a website that's like a link aggregator or something like that. Note that we need to copy the result of running this generator into our routes file. So to do that, I'm going to open Vim with the router file, and I'm going to come down here to the main scope and add this output that we copied. Now let's run the generator again. This time we're going to add another model. We're going to call them projects, and this is just so we have 2 things to look at. We're going to copy those routes once again into our router file. We can put them right below links. So now we've got 2 kinds of models we can look at. We're going to have a links page and a projects page, and we're just going to use them as examples. Once Mix Phoenix server is running, go ahead and open this project up, and let's go directly to that links page. So we've got links and we've got projects, and we're going to just use these as an example of how the LiveView lifecycle works. So while we're talking about this, I'm going to pull up the Phoenix LiveView documentation, and I suggest reading through it if you haven't, but we're going to read through it a little bit together. So as the documentation says, the LiveView lifecycle always begins as a regular HTTP call. The first time you load a LiveView, the call and response is going to happen just like any web framework. It's going to receive the request over HTTP, and it's going to return HTML back. That should be pretty familiar to you if you've used any web framework or web tools. What's different is what happens next. It's kind of like a single page app. The JavaScript from Phoenix LiveView is going to load. It's going to open a WebSocket back to the server, and everything is going to happen again. Once the WebSocket is connected, the whole initialization is going to run again. So basically everything runs twice. There are 3 callbacks that you need to know about. Mount is one of them. The other one is handle params. And the last one is render. These are the 3 callbacks that are involved in rendering live views. Mount is the first one. Every time a live view is initialized, it's going to call mount. Secondly, it's going to call handle params. And finally, it's going to call render. Let's open up that link live view that we generated. You can see it's got 2 of those callbacks, mount and handle params, but there's no render callback. The reason for that is that live views can implicitly find a file named the same as the live view file with the .heeks extension, and it will use that as the render callback. So because the generator gave us this file, index.html heeks, and it's named the same as index, it's going to pick that up as the render function. If we came in here and we said render with assigns, and we put our own render function, just say hello world or something like that, and then we check the browser, as you can see, it has hijacked what was loading before. Now we just get hello world. If we delete that, now we have the template again. And again, the template is this file right here. So I just wanted to cover that first because render is kind of the easiest of the 3 callbacks to understand. It is only responsible for returning HTML. The only thing you need to know is it has that magic behavior to it. Now let's look at the function signatures for mount and handle params. Starting with mount, the first thing it receives is params, which is self-explanatory. It's the URL parameters. And then session is a little bit more complicated. It's similar to the session system in like Rails. It's the session in Phoenix. You can put stuff in here and it lasts for the session. And then you have the socket. The socket is like the con object in other Phoenix controllers. And then mount is the only callback, I think, that's supposed to return an OK tuple. The others mostly return those gen server tuples where they're like no reply and then the other value. Now let's look at handle params. Handle params also receives the parameters, but it receives the URI as well, which is a little bit different, and then it receives the socket. One thing to note is that all these callbacks we're going to look at are always going to receive the socket. That's how functional programming works, right? We have to receive the thing we're going to act on and then return that thing. That's how plug works. The con is that kind of object for plug, and in LiveView, that's the socket. So everything we're doing, we're going to receive the socket, we're going to do something to it, and then we're going to return it. So I think the first confusing thing to understand here is that handle params, if you just read the name, you would think this is the place I handle params. This is where I need to handle URL parameters. But of course, as you can see, mount also has access to the params. So why is that? Well, it's because this little part here, it is invoked after mount or wherever there is a live navigation event caused by push patch or link patch. To understand what that means, we need to go to another page of the documentation. Let's type live navigation into the search bar and go take a look at this page. This page is really short. I recommend you read it yourself, but I'm going to kind of summarize it for you. Basically, there's 3 ways that live views can navigate between each other. First off, you have a regular page load. LiveView has these link components here that you can use, and whenever you have this href attribute, like a regular anchor tag, it's going to be a regular page load. It's going to be a full HTTP call, full page reload. There's none of the hot reloading of the page like a SPA or how LiveView works when it mounts the WebSocket. The second option is this navigate option here. If we click on the link component, it's going to tell us a little bit more. This option is for navigating between live views. So this does the thing that we want to use LiveView for, which is these hot page reloads. It's not going to do a full reload. It's not going to delete the whole page and recreate it like a regular link. It's going to diff the page and the new LiveView is going to load in place. And as a consequence, it's like interacting with a SPA. It's much faster. The user feedback of clicking on links with navigate feels a lot better. Finally, there's a third option, and it's this patch option. This is for going to the current LiveView, but changing the params. Some reason you may want to do this is assume maybe you are making like a shopping cart, an e-commerce website, and you have filters on your products. When you change the filters, a lot of times you might want to reflect that in the URL so that if the user reloads the page, well, when they reload the page, if you put those filters in the URL, then the filters are still going to be set when they reload the page. Of course, there's other ways to do this. You can put state in local storage. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. But trying to put as much state that you want to persist between page reloads in the URL is a pretty good idea. Now, if we go back to the live navigation page, you can see it talks about how there's 2 different ways to use these pieces of functionality. First off, you have these functions. There's push patch and push navigate. And then you have the link component. But they do functionally the same thing. So if you're on the server side, and you want to redirect the user to another live view, you'd probably use push navigate. If you are on the client side and you want to have a link in your HTML that when the user clicks on, it's going to take them to a new live view, that's when you would use a link with the navigate option. This is a really good breakdown of it here. If you want a full page reload, use redirect with the con or link href. If you want to go between live views, use push navigate or link navigate. And if you want to change the current live view, but just change the params, use push patch or link patch. And here, helpfully, the documentation talks about handle params. So this is where handle params comes into play. Handle params behaves differently on patches. When you navigate with a patch, only handle params is going to be called. In all other circumstances, mount and handle params are both going to be called. That is what's different about handle params and patch. It's specifically made for use with patch. And ultimately, this is why handle params exists, and this is why it has params and mount has params, because you can kind of decide to handle URL params in either one. Not every live view you make is going to use patch, and if that's the case, in a lot of cases you can just kind of ignore handle params and just use mount. But there's some caveats to that. As we can see by looking at the callback signatures, handle params gets the URL. So if you need to do something with the URL, you're going to need to use handle params. I wish there was a hard and fast rule I could tell you, but it really just comes down to a matter of opinion. Now let's go back to the code and let's add some debug statements to see this in action. So I've opened up link live here, and I'm also going to open up project live, the index page on both cases. And to both of them, I'm going to add a debug statement in mount and handle params. So I'm just going to say mount in here and debug handle params in here. So I have the browser and the terminal open at the same time, and I'm going to clear the terminal with Control K or Command K, and then I'm going to load the page and check out what we see here. So as we can see, mount and handle params both fired twice. If we look at the waterfall diagram and we can mouse over these two sockets here, one of these is the LiveView socket, the other is the live reload socket, which is just a dev tool. So if we mouse over, we can see this one is the LiveView socket because it says /live, and this one is the live reload socket, so you can ignore this one. But if you click this one, we can look at the data that was sent over the wire. So this is what was sent when we established the connection. If we scroll down to the bottom here, we can also see these heartbeats. So these are basically messages that get sent back and forth to keep the socket alive. So you can ignore those heartbeats. This is the only one we care about. This is the call and response from the WebSocket. The one in green is what the client sent to the socket, and we know that because I believe they're always green, and it has this little arrow going up, and then this is the response we got back. Now let's test out that live navigation thing. I'm going to add a link to the header here to jump back and forth between the links live view and the projects live view. So I'm going to come to app.html.heeks. This is one of the two layout files for live view. If we look at this directory, we can see there's an app layout and a root layout. I might talk about that more in another video, but basically the app layout has more access to live view stuff. You can change stuff on the assigns and they'll change here, whereas the root is static. So open up app.html.heeks, and we're going to add a link here. We're going to say link, and because we want to go to another live view, we're going to use navigate. And then we're going to use the sigil for links that was added in Phoenix, one of the recent versions. We're going to have this one go to links, and we're going to call it links. And then the next one we're going to call projects. Just realized this is actually lowercase. So if we come back to the browser here, now we've got this links button and this projects button to go in between our live views. And if you notice on the side here, I still have the DevTools open. When we're navigating between the pages, it's not reloading everything. We're staying on the same page and the content is loading in place. We can change that if we change these navigates to href and then come back here and click the buttons again. Now we can see the whole page reloads each time. So again, that's the difference between href and navigate. We can also show off patch. If we add a new link here, we can say that this is patch. And let's add some kind of query param here. Say query equals foo. and change it to links foo. Now watch what happens. We're on the links page here, and if I hover over, you can see the links URL. If I hit links foo, nothing really changed, but if we look at the URL, we've got the query param. Now I changed this back to navigate. So let's demo it again. This time we're going to be looking at the links page and we're going to see what's happening in the terminal. So if we reload the page, we get our distinctive double mount, mount twice, handle params twice. Now when we click projects, we only have it fire once. So that is the difference with navigate. We're going to only get one mount and one handle params afterwards. If we come back to links again and reload the page, we have our mount handle params. Now let's hit links foo, and we only got handle params. So in essence, that's the difference. As long as you understand how these three things interact, you understand live navigation. So now that we've looked at that, I want to talk about some common misconceptions. So first one we're familiar with now. A lot of people think that you have to access params and handle params. You don't. If you're writing a live view that's going to use patch, maybe you want to handle those params in handle params because you're going to have to. If you're writing a live view that doesn't patch anytime, you can just put it all in mount pretty much. Again, with some caveats, if you want to use the URL, you have to do that in handle params. If you wanted to use the session, you have to do that in mount, but they're rules of thumb. Second big misconception, and I suffered from this when I was learning LiveView. I read the documentation and I believed that you had to make sure data was loaded in mount for the page to work without JavaScript. I believed after reading the documentation the first time that second page load, once the socket is connected, behaved like patch does and only calls handle params. And that's not correct. The page load that happens after the socket's connected behaves exactly the same as the unconnected load. It's going to do both mount and handle params. There is a way to query the socket to see if it's connected. You can look that up in the docs. And occasionally that can be useful for doing something that you only want to happen once the live view process is live. An example of that might be connecting to a pub sub channel or something like that. Now let's talk about data loading. So how do you decide what to do in mount versus handle params? Where do you load your data? Well, there's a couple rules of thumb. First off, if you need access to the URL for some reason to load data, you're going to have to do it in handle params. If you need something from the session to load data, you're going to have to do it in mount. If your live view needs to support patch, it's going to have to be done in handle params. But that's pretty much where the hard rules start and stop. Everything else is kind of a matter of opinion. There is some common misconceptions. So one thing, you don't need to do all your initial assigning in mount. I have seen a lot of people make this mistake. Say they have a variable they want to set. Let's call it hey. I've seen a lot of people think that you need to set it in mount for it to be visible on the first render. That's not the case. You can do this in handle params and it works just fine. The render is going to happen last, so initial setup can be done in either one. Another thing you don't want to do is duplicate your data loading across both. I have seen people do this in their live views as well, where they have the same data loaded on both sides because they think that has to happen for patch to work. You don't want to do that. You want to decide for each piece of data, do I want to load this in mount or do I want to load this in handle params? So I guess let's come to my opinion. So me personally, I try to not use handle params as much as I can. I try to do most things in mount, and I try to have most of my live views not even have a handle params callback. That, again, is totally just opinion. I've talked to other people that like to do the exact opposite. Some people like to have no mount callback whatsoever and do everything in handle params. If we come back to our live view here and we just have it say, hey world, and we comment out the mount, as you can see, everything works just fine. You don't need to have one or the other. If you don't have one of these callbacks, it fills it in with like a default from the live view. So I think that's about it. I know maybe this was a little bit dry. We went into some pretty deep detail on this one, but I think this is really fundamental to understand before continuing on with live view. The next video, I'm planning to make a little bit more of a practical deep dive, trying to teach you how to make your first live view. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe.